So today we're lucky to have Professor Asha Bhandari with us, who will be presenting on her marvelous book here, Freedom to Care. Professor Bhandari is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Iowa. And in addition to Freedom to Care, she also co-edited this book, Caring for Liberalism, Dependency, and Liberal Political Theory with Amy Baer. Also a great book. If you haven't seen it, you should pick it up and read the chapters in it. And she's also the author of many articles on care ethics, diversity, health, and other topics. So if you haven't been introduced to Professor Bhandari's work, today will be a great introduction, and continue down the line with her other readings. The format for today, she's going to summarize the main topics from her book for 15 minutes or so. We're then going to have commentaries from, I think we're going to go first with Professor Jennifer Nedelsky, a professor of law at Osgoode Hall Law School and author of Law's Relations, and as I understand, the soon to be completed and released Part-Time for All, and Professor Tamara Metz, professor of political science at Reed College, and author of Untying the Knot: Marriage, the State, and the Case for Their Divorce. A great title. So we'll go. Professor Bhandari will present. Then we'll have two, brief each commentary about 10 minutes. Then Professor Bhandari will comment briefly on that, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments and discussion and all that kind of stuff. For the questions, to keep it orderly, I think that the easiest thing to do is just to go down to the chat box, which is right in the middle on the bottom of the screen. Just click on chat, a chat box opens, just type "I have a question" and hit return. It'll come to me, and I'll just call on you in order to answer the questions. If you have some kind of comment or you want to jump in on a discussion, I think it's fine to just speak up and say, like, hey, can I make a follow-up point or something like that? I think we can handle that sort of thing. So that's all I have to say about organization and that. I'm going to now turn things over to Professor Bhandari, who will answer the question, are you now or have you ever been a liberal? So.
It's a drinking game, right? No, okay.
That's right.
Before we start, I saw in the chat the question about whether the transcripts can be enabled. I don't know if you saw that, Dan.
Oh.
So if you can, is that for closed captioning?
Yeah, I thought that was all set up.
Okay.
Do I have to do anything else?
So I'll just highlight that, and I'll.
Oh wait, live transcript assigned to type. There. Okay.
Great.
I've enabled.
Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dan, for organizing this event and the whole, this whole Care Forum series this whole year. I think has been really marvelous. And thank you to Jenny Nedelsky and Tamara Metz for commenting, spending their time during this difficult year on commenting on the book. And really, I'm so delighted to see, all of you here, and including many people whose work has been really foundational to my work. So it's really, I'm really delighted. Okay. So I'm going to start by sort of summarizing the way I approach care, and then I'll summarize the book, and then I will answer I'll say why I'm a liberal, in fact, at the end. Care is the spine of culture. How care is provided, including to whom and by whom, is the primary structuring concern for every social form. Although the presence of a caregiving arrangement is universal, its precise nature varies. Caregiving arrangements include the practices, norms, and laws that make something count as a family unit, as well as socialization into particular roles within it. Because existing caregiving arrangements are unjust, the injustice of these distributions contaminate our social norms and understandings about who should tend to whom. Requirements of deference and entitlement correspond to race and gender, with societal expectations for women of color to both attitudinally defer to others and to materially tend to their needs. Thus, the caregiving skill of attentiveness blends with the social role of attendant, and the social positions occupied by women of color overlap with the idea of a caregiver. Due to the salience of gender as a sorting variable for caregiving, the distribution of care has been accurately characterized as a feminist issue. However, individuals' expectations about receiving in-person dependency care are permeated by social understandings that depend on the predominant hierarchies of that society, which also influence whether a person is expected to contribute to hands-on dependency care of others. For instance, care practices in Western societies where liberalism is endemic uphold the status quo of white entitlement by appropriating the care rendered by people of color. In addition, many caregiving arrangements worldwide license men to be unavailable to meet the dependency needs of others, while assuming that they will nonetheless receive the care they need. Because receiving care is a vital primary good that is secured in the context of broader systems of social cooperation, and the care we receive varies without perfectly corresponding to legitimate needs, the receipt of care is properly understood as a subject of distributive justice. These claims and conceptualizations frame the liberal theory of distributive justice that I advance in Freedom to Care. The resultant liberal theory of justice, which I call the theory of liberal dependency care, addresses care, race, gender, and the intersectional social locations occupied by women of color, with special attention to the social role of the person assigned to be the caregiver. The 5 chapters of Part 1 establish the theoretical foundations of the liberal contract theory approach to care I defend, which theorizes care abstractly as a general good. Chapter 1 is an introduction to the overarching theory of liberal dependency care that locates it in the context of the ethics of care, feminist liberalism, and liberalism more broadly. Chapter 2 responds to Eva Katay's dependency criterion of adequacy by defending the value of an individualistic approach to persons in the Rawlsian original position. With the desirability of a liberal approach to dependency care established, chapters 3, 4, and 5 embark on propounding my core modifications to liberalism's mapping concepts and structure of justification. These foundational changes to liberalism are required in light of the invisibility of caregiving arrangements and their entwinement with inequalities and assumptions about whose needs give rise to legitimate demands for caregiving. Chapter 3 demonstrates the need for the arrow of care map as a concept to identify distributive inequalities across the society in a way that can be analyzed by race, gender, social class, and remains open-ended about other possible sorting categories. The arrow of care map is a concept that enables tracking a variety of distributive patterns for a systems level analysis of caregiving arrangements. Chapters 4 and 5 continue the construction of what I call 2-level contract theory. A form of Rawlsian hypothetical acceptability is the first level of my modified contract theory. In chapter 4, I argue that because our ways of thinking about concern for others are polluted by deep and pervasive social inequalities, we should retain the Rawlsian assumption of mutually disinterested parties for the original position. Chapter 4 then defends the 4 principles that serve as constraints on any possibly just society. The second level of 2-level contract theory asserts the premise that theorizing about what would be acceptable behind the veil of ignorance is inevitably informed by the life experiences of theorists and the knowledge we have of lives that differ significantly from our own. Therefore, the Rawlsian hypothetical acceptability that I endorse also requires conditions in the real world, including, crucially, autonomy skills for real people in the real world. So there I've moved from the sort of abstraction into the real world. And that argument is taken up in earnest in chapter 5, where I defend a Millian-Myersian conception of autonomy as a legitimate aim of my liberalism. The chapters in part 2 then identify the vital components of adequate care practices. The conceptual foundation of any new model of caregiving is a concept of care that captures its dual nature as both labor with burdens and a domain of human excellence. Chapters 6 and 7 articulate liberal dependency care's commitment to respecting individuality and personal choice in the domain of caregiving. A liberal society should enable broad latitude for individual choice within the constraints set by the shared work of society. And note here that that position just straightforwardly follows John Stuart Mill. In chapter 7, I defend a principle for the provision of care to guide real-world change that will promote maximal latitude for caregivers, while also intervening in the status quo, which I call the strong procedural principle for autonomous caregiving. It's a policy guiding principle tailored to Western liberal societies like the US. For a particular caregiving practice to be a just one, it must satisfy the following conditions. It must be a product of the exercise of individual autonomy. Background conditions must be modified so that everyone has a basic level of caregiving skills, and incentives and disincentives for caregiving should not be set up in ways that track ascriptive group membership. In the final 2 chapters of the book, my interrogation of the relationship between skills, choice, and a person's cherished relationships leads me to articulate the importance of a state of affairs that I call being at home, which includes a sense of ease in the world. In chapter 8, I introduced the idea of customary care practices to identify the public and private practices for securing care within a given social form. Moving beyond societies that share the US's particular emphasis on individual choice, I defend 3 metrics along which societies may evaluate themselves: individual choice, the level of care provision relative to legitimate care needs, and an assessment of the fairness of the distribution. My theory is compatible with a wide range of forms of social organization, and it does not assume the immutability or primacy of the market as the best way to organize human activities and labor. Instead, I leave open the particular practices that can be part of a just society, beyond the constraints and procedural criteria that I specify. Chapter 9 argues that being at home is promoted by greater access to primary goods and the ability to retain one's most important intimate relationships. Because care is deeply embedded in our social forms, but our social forms are unjust, individuals assigned to be caregivers make choices that may inflict damage on close relationships when those de facto caregivers pursue other autonomously chosen goals. I argue that the desirability of the status of being at home in one's world elucidates some resistance to transitioning to a just society. The nature of the dilemma that can arise between personal goals and the health of a person's existing relationships, I call this social position the Cartini position, points toward the necessity of a distributive understanding of caregiving arrangements. I conclude by arguing that action guiding proposals for transitional justice must take into account both the value of the intelligibility of actions and individuals' needs to recognizably communicate concern for people they care about. Okay, so that's the summary of the chapters. And as promised, I'm going to end with a brief comment about why I defend a liberal care theory rather than a more robustly care ethical approach to a just society. First of all, I separate liberalism as a philosophical doctrine from the capitalist social forms that are the basis upon which liberalism is often impugned. I do not really engage with questions about markets because every society of human beings must have customary care practices comprising a caregiving arrangement, but markets don't have the same degree of social necessity. So markets are a lot more contingent than the fact that we all need to have a caregiving arrangement. I also consider liberalism the doctrine with the conceptual resources to identify when an individual's life energy is being grafted onto the substance of another. And this language of grafting may be recognizable to some as the term from Marilyn Frye, which I use actually in the sense employed by Maria Lugones. She uses that term. A concern with having one's substance grafted onto others becomes more salient when the social roles and expectations occupied by women of color move to the foreground of the theory. When thinking from a social position informed by narratives applied to non-white women, the diffuse and extensive nature of the expectations to care for universal others rather than particular others, such as, for instance, one's own family, becomes a salient matter of justice. Liberalism's conceptualization of individuals as the basic building blocks of the theory and its corresponding endorsement of individual autonomy secure protection against exploitation at the theoretical level. I also maintain awareness of the possibility of scarcity as an objective circumstance of justice. The possibility of scarcity must remain in view because, despite the fact that existing systems of social cooperation secure caregivers for some vulnerable people, we do not receive equal amounts of care. And of course, this has become abundantly clear in this past year during the pandemic. The levels of care received are not equal in absolute terms, nor are these levels equal when they are indexed to our legitimate needs. Instead, social hierarchies enable members of privileged social groups to receive the care they need, and then more. Translated into the racial hierarchies of the US, the needs of white children are met at higher levels than the needs of Black and brown children. Ultimately, I make two foundational modifications to the very structure of liberalism based on evaluating the methodological flaws exposed by its exclusion of care. They are two-level contract theory and the arrow of care map, both of which build in theoretical remedies to the problem that our intuitions about care are not yet adequately evaluated and vetted. Before we can know if people will freely choose to act as caregivers, we must make more aspects of the arrangement transparent. And this is what these pieces of theory enable. In addition, on a practical level, we need to remedy the social distribution of skills and dispositions to receive and give care. Once these corrections are made to our skewed intuitions and abilities, we will have a better understanding of the nature of hands-on caregiving. It's only when the rampant injustice embedded in existing decisions to be a caregiver has been altered that we can truly identify who autonomously wants to engage in caregiving. Okay, so that's the end of my summary.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so Jenny, you're gonna go? Got it, okay.
Thank you so much. So I think you will have all been able to tell by this excellent summary that this is a really important book. It's extremely well written, well argued, and I learned from it. And to go to the question of who's a liberal and why talk to them, I think it's actually extremely important because millions of people around the world go to higher education to learn about justice and equality, and care is not included in courses on justice and equality. So the university educated are taught that care doesn't matter, that it is not one of those things we need to take into account as we reflect on our core values. So engaging the kind of people who teach those courses to see that they have to take care seriously is really, really important. And I hope they pick up this book because I think they will be persuaded by its very high level of articulation and careful argument. I think of it as an original, thoughtful, exemplary engagement with Rawlsian liberalism and a generous expansion of what Rawlsian liberalism could ultimately offer. Now, you heard Asha briefly mention her really important concept of being at home. And so I need to say at the outset that this world of analytic liberal theorists, which I'm so glad Asha is engaging with, is not a world in which I feel at home. I feel deeply alienated by it, and that impinges on my capacity to engage with these important arguments. And I think it's an important enough issue for many people that I'm going to return to that at the end of sort of be a matching piece to Asha's comment about why she does want to identify in that way. So let me begin with some of the things that I found most helpful and important as contributions. The first is her presentation of care as an arena of excellence, even genius. And I was really struck when reading this that looking back at my own manuscript and at sources I've turned to, like Sarah Ruddicks, who clearly know this and believe it, they don't say it. They don't say it with the clarity that Asha does. And I think this is a tremendously important contribution and should shape how anybody thinks about participating in care when they envision it as a location for excellence and even genius. But I should add here, and this anticipates a wider point I'll come back to, that I'm so struck by the importance of this articulation because I already believe in the value of care, and this articulates a particular piece of it. But I think for those who don't already have this, these claims of the capacity for excellence and genius in care may not resonate at all because there is almost no evidence offered to back them up. And this goes to this recurrent issue that I mentioned, and that is that, like most works of philosophy and theory dealing with important social issues, most of the argument is at a fairly high level of abstraction, and that is true even within these two stages. Yet, like almost all such arguments, it repeatedly needs to rely on empirical claims. But the methodology is not attuned to the corresponding need to look for empirical evidence. And I should say that I understand the reluctance to do this. I think I added a full 2 years to Law's Relations, to learning what I needed to learn to add all the concrete examples. So it's not nothing to actually back up the empirical claims that are embedded in it. But it's important to recognize, and that this is in no way distinctive to this argument. It's characteristic of the genre to be making tacit empirical claims with no empirical evidence. So now to the concept of being at home within social forms. I think this is such a deeply thoughtful engagement with the issues of how difficult a profound transformation around norms of care will be for many. So Asha doesn't use the language of compassion, but I think she demonstrates both her own capacity for it and the importance of compassion when undertaking transformation that goes to the core dimensions of people's identity and sense of meaning. And although I don't agree with all her conclusions arising from this sensitivity, particularly about the time frame for transformation, and here I remind you all of the relatively rapid transformations around acceptance of same-sex relationships, but nevertheless, I think all advocates of deep transformation can really learn something important from her approach, from this reflection on being at home and social forms. And third, especially toward the end of the book, in the final few chapters, there is a real eloquence to her language. She offers an impressive ability to express complex ideas in a way that can really take hold of people's imagination. So you heard her invoking this great phrase that caregiving arrangements are the spine of culture. To me, this captures the foundational nature of care, the way it shapes and connects to so much in our lives, as well as its links to the very lenses through which we see the world. And I think it's so important for people to grasp the significance of care that effective, evocative language like this is tremendously important. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to my concerns, some of my concerns with the argument. So I think the biggest is the weight placed here on education in public schools as the primary mechanism for training in particularly male competence in care, and somewhat more tacitly in shifting gender norms around care. This is the most important example of the problem of relying on empirical claims without empirical evidence. The claim is that public education can do this. And that, again, a bit more tacitly, that even though public education is a state-funded and state-controlled enterprise, it is minimally coercive, or at least the least coercive effective mechanism. Here I was reflecting today, walking the dog, that many of you may or may not know the way in which Texas holds a virtual monopoly on textbooks across the country. You want to think about that when you think about relying on public education as the means for transforming core notions of care. I could not find a single reference to studies about what public education can actually accomplish. So thinking about the efficacy issues, one example to reflect on, many parents and teachers will know that efforts at civic education, while widely recognized as foundationally important components of democracy, these are generally dismal failures. Students treat them as jokes. And although I have not gone back to the studies, I think this is a very widespread phenomenon. People try it in different ways, it never works. They're always crummy courses, everybody hates them, nobody pays attention to them. A related finding in studies on education is that bilingual or multilingual countries' public education fails staggeringly in teaching the non-dominant language. Language training is much less successful in those countries than it is in other countries where there is no normative overlay on the importance of learning the other official language. And this, I should say, fits with my anecdotal experience of the astonishingly poor education in French in English language schools in Ontario. So here's an effort at a normative, a really deeply important, politically, culturally normative project that the schools just can't do. And it's repeated in many different contexts. And of course, there are the ferocious battles, sometimes over electoral control of school boards, sometimes in courts, around sex education in schools. I don't know what the studies are finding about the efficacy of shifting gender norms around violence, sexual pleasure, safe sex, or same-sex relationships, but I do know that those studies exist. And that's, again, a place to look to actually assess the competence of public education for this task, upon which everything rests in this particular version of the argument about how to transform our care norms. So before wasting the whole rate of an argument about changing the social form of care around public education, there should be some engagement with the empirical evidence around related projects of skill and knowledge acquisition that are similarly embedded in norm change. I would note that Mayor Levinson, I was at a workshop with her, she's a Harvard education professor, says that the US has a long history of placing education as the solution to problems, including problems of democracy, and that this has always proven to be a mistake. I should just very briefly note that I think the care map really could use an example of how it would work with an actual data set. Because otherwise it's very hard to tell how helpful it will be, what sort of normative judgments will be involved in actually taking data and applying to it. So now a brief word about autonomy, coercion, and new norms around care. I think I'm going to say this more briefly than my note, because I do want to get to the final point. So really, my argument here is that Asha is very concerned that the solution to the care problem not infringe on individual autonomy. And as some of you know, my own argument is that everybody should participate in care through social norms, not through law. And I think that real test case for the persuasiveness of the autonomy component of her argument is replace the word care with work in all of those arguments. So most people recognize that every society needs both, in the old-fashioned feminist economist language, needs both productive labor and reproductive labor. So this is about reproductive labor, about care. Would she be willing to make those same autonomy arguments? Everybody should just work according to their individual preference. As long as it's not ascriptively organized, we rely on individual preference. This would be a radical transformation. It is one that some people who back a genuinely livable universal basic income believe in, right? Because that's the way to actually remove coercion from work. But so far, no society is organized like that. And roughly speaking, I think we should make comparable sorts of thinking about care. The society needs it. Everybody should participate in both productive and reproductive labor. And I don't, so I'll just leave that. So let me just look, and I would just add to my own picture about why having everybody doing care will make a difference. Then they will be learning about care experientially, not in classrooms where we should have very little hope of the kinds of transformative education we're looking for. So I'm going to try to do this briefly. Dan did say I could have 15 minutes. I hope I'll keep to just that. Asha talks repeatedly and helpfully about the importance of different cultural forms. And so I want to turn now to my own experience of this book as part of a cultural form, which I find alien and alienating. I just want to close with a glimpse of why I do not feel at home in the cultural form of which this book is an instance. As context, I would note that I think the most deeply thoughtful insights Asha has to offer come at the end of the book, where she's shifting a little bit away from the foundations of the Rawlsian focus. But I personally would never have gotten to that end if I had not committed to this panel. So I remember that the book is not primarily aimed at me. It's aimed at engaging liberal theorists, which I've already said I think is very important. But I think the issues that this book addresses, are matter to a much wider range of people. So let me just try to briefly share one way I have come up with thinking about my sense of this as a very distinctive, peculiar cultural norm, that this form of argument, which, as I say, is in no way idiosyncratic to Asha. It's a perfectly respectable kind of intellectual pursuit within the academy. But I imagine myself gathering together with people from a wide range of diverse cultural backgrounds and saying, let's reflect together on what human capacities matter for making judgments about the really foundational structure of our society that would enable people to thrive and to pursue their own values, to shape and articulate collective values. And I imagine that the range of human capacities that people would suggest would include curiosity, insight into the kind of creatures human beings are, what they need to thrive, how people connect to one another, how they learn about the world, how they understand their relationship to the earth, the ability to take the perspectives of others, good judgment, how to know what really matters to people, a capacity for empathy, the capacity to know one's own emotions, and to tune into how they resonate in the body. So then I imagine gathering together this full range of human capacity that could be brought to bear on the very project that the original position is supposed to be helping us with. And then I try to imagine explaining to an Anishinaabeg elder, that's one of the major Indigenous groups in this part of Ontario, that of course the very first step in this whole process, before we do anything else, is to use only one's analytic abilities and to presume that all the people that we're envisioning are interested in self-interest alone. And then, of course, I add that some basic understanding of human nature and human needs can be added in. And then I imagine immediately being met, but this presupposition of being concerned only with your self-interest is in direct violation of all of their intuitions about what human beings are really like. Then, of course, you could say, well, there's a story here about why this is only the first step, and it's a useful step to achieve critical distance. And then you would also need to explain why analytic intelligence only is what matters at this first step. But I doubt either of these explanations would be very effective. It would need to explain, for example, why distance is a compelling universal metaphor for the conditions of knowledge acquisition or good judgment. Now, of course, my imagination here is inflected by my own response to this cultural form. And I should say, just note that this is probably autobiographically inflected further by having spent my very first teaching job, my first full-time teaching job at Princeton, where I was in a state of continually barely suppressed rage for years by being surrounded by liberal hegemony, and I don't think I've ever quite gotten over this. So I'll close by saying that I think both the insight and eloquence of this important book increases the further it gets from the stipulated foundations of its arguments. And I hope that future inquiries will stray further and further while engaging with issues of freedom, autonomy, and care with the insight, determination, and compassion revealed in this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. So we talked before, and we're going to go ahead and have Tamara give her comments, and then Asha will briefly respond, and then we'll open up. I already see, I guess, a couple of you have hands up. Is that right? Are those hands for clapping, or can't tell? Oh, those are clapping hands. Okay. I never understand these things. Okay, well, good. Anyway, if you already have questions, you can start typing that into the chat room. If you want to get queued up to ask your questions.
Okay, well, I'm glad that I'm going second, in part because what I can say is I can maybe shorten my comments, I hope, and but say that I'm deeply sympathetic to actually both to Jenny's comments and to Asha's project. And maybe yeah, so a lot of what Jenny just said, I think, captures some of my both appreciation and questions about this book. So here goes. So I was on a panel last week with Asha and a few others at the APA, including Janet Jacobson. And after the panel, Janet and I were corresponding, and she raised the question, or she made the observation that the politics of care has returned. She feels like it's a subject of interest in the academy in a way that it wasn't. It was, when she was a graduate student, which I think she said was in the 80s or 90s. And so she was wondering, why is that? Why is the politics of care back in our scope? And I think one sort of obvious reason is that just that women and people of color are more present in the academy, and therefore as people who encounter the demands of care in a much more more regularly than white men, I suppose. So our life experience shows up in our work. So that seems like one part of the answer. But of course, that's been true for a while, and it seems also obvious that what I might call the squeeze of what I will call neoliberal capitalism and its attendant political rationality. And by that, I know that neoliberalism makes it's a term to which many people are allergic. So let me just say that I think it's a useful concept precisely because it locates kind of most or the salient features of a particular historical period, that is to say, the one we're in. So it refers to a kind of the dominance of the market in our social formation, and including a kind of the globalized and racialized versions of it. So as Asha can anticipate, one of my questions will be, can you bracket in any serious analysis of care, can you bracket questions of the market? And I just doubt that. But I'll get back to that. So even before the pandemic, let's see, even before the pandemic, this social formation, a neoliberal social formation, put the squeeze on care, on sites of care. And the pandemic, of course, exposed and worsened this fact that basically part of the fuel of this formation or the system is precisely squeezing the essential work of care. And this is most obvious in the global care chain and in the treatment of so-called essential workers in the US. But of course, it was poignantly felt by people in, I'm just gonna, in the kind of middle class of the global North. And therefore, not surprisingly, I think it shows up in the academy, right? Were it just the essential workers who are being touched by this, it probably wouldn't quite show up, but it showed up in our lives, and so it shows up in our work. So And it also is showing up in real politics, which I think has to do, it's an interesting question about why is it showing up in real politics? And again, it may have something to do with the middle class, but anyway, it's a good thing. And as I read Asha's book, I was reflecting on her book in this context. And also in the context of the central project or promise of the book, which is a liberal theory of care. And as I said last week, it's been already implied, like she's saving liberalism from itself. She promises to save liberalism from itself. And I think for both of these reasons, the actual historical moment we're in, and for the promise that she could save liberalism for itself, this book is enormously important. And I don't know that I've seen a more compelling attempt to save liberalism from itself. And I think that if in this question of care and the kind of the way that liberalism has been inattentive to our universal vulnerability, it's, to my mind, the fatal problem, or the most serious problem that liberalism has. So if someone can answer this question for liberalism, then they've done maybe the most important work that it needs. And let's see. So and it's important that the way that liberalism has done that, of course, is by stowing care away in that kind of, by hiding it under or in elements of the theory, as it were, so it's not admitting to its presence. And obviously the family is the most obvious place that happens, but I want to say it's also happening in the object of private property. I've been teaching Locke the last couple of weeks, and the way that private property and the family fit together in hiding this stuff has just been, it's like, when you see something and all of a sudden you see it everywhere. Wow, go back and read Locke, and with this in mind, it's kind of mind-blowing. Anyway, so I think that Asha's project, and I guess here I'm with Jenny completely, that I think that I want to say this is the most important book about liberal theory that I've read in a long, long time. So that's super important. And maybe I would say, I want to say it's not just important for the academics who teach this stuff, though I think but there is a way that I think the value of liberal theory in the, let's say, the Anglophone context is that it can help us, I think, as Asha says, helps us see, makes vivid our own kind of in our own, the implicit commitments of a dominant way of viewing the world, and therefore allows us to have allows us to think critically about those. So, and I don't think it stays in the university in this way. I think it extends in many ways beyond that. But okay, so my main questions are how can liberal dependency care theory, LDC, help at best, or at least not bolster the squeeze? And how compelling is Asha's answer to the troubles that ail liberalism? So Asha hangs on to liberalism precisely with this insistence of the separate and equal worth of every individual, precisely because it promises to protect against the violations that are most significant for givers of care. And she hangs on to a modified ideal theory or theorizing because of the critical distance from the injustices of actual arrangements. And she hangs on to normative theorizing, well, because what else seems to be implied? What else would you do as a political philosopher? And on this, I'm going to return, but I want to just put out in the discussion before, or in my comments, and I'll come back to it. The two other possibilities, right? One is James Tully's work or essay from a couple decades ago, I think at this point, political philosophy as a critical activity. And basically his argument is, informed by maybe a little Foucault, maybe a little Marx, that the task of a political philosopher is fundamentally critical. And that there's the danger of, and specifically thinking critically about language and the normative and conceptual assumptions that get imported into what we do without a kind of deep critical attention to language, and then also being drawn by actual humans to sites of oppression and thinking, analyzing those sites concretely as a way of exposing oppression. And then the other theorist that I'm thinking of that might be a contrast to the answer, this is what we should be doing, that is normative theory. I'm thinking of Bonnie Honig and democratic theory, who also worry about the displacement of politics that happens in a kind of the normative theory genre. Thank you, Jenny, that Asha is participating in. Okay, so I'll come back to that. So what stands out as some of the key contributions? And I think I should, have I been talking for 10 minutes already, Dan? Yeah, okay, all right. I want to give folks a chance to weigh in. There's nothing more annoying than a commentator who goes on and on and on. Okay, so I think some of the things that stand out as major contributions, as I've already said, is bringing care to the liberals, putting our universal dependency at the center of a theory of justice. Or our vulnerability to not being cared, as Asha says, cared for. Yes. And attention to the way that it gets, the costs of care get hidden, and its benefits and burdens. The distribution of its benefits and burdens are hidden by unacknowledged structures of race, class, caste, sex, gender, and national station. And the attempt to make it visible using the arrow of care map, I found to be potentially very useful. And the abstraction that takes place with the concept of the arrow of care map, I think I'm sympathetic to the idea that it's precisely valuable because it pulls us out of our cultural context or our embeddedness. But I have some similar concerns to Jenny's, and I maybe the last bit that I find particularly a particularly useful contribution, I think, to liberal theorizing is the two-level contract. The two-level contract theorizing. And I wonder if the second level, so the second level is the level of in the real world. And Asha makes the argument that those people need to be educated in essentially, I see it as a kind of critical, having a critical awareness of ability to understand these other forces that structure and hide care, for instance. I wonder if that is, maybe I'm with Jenny. I'm a little, it's unclear to me if you're talking about political theorists, then why don't we have to integrate more fully into our work, not just empirical studies, but empirical studies viewed through a critical lens, right? The problem with just relying straightforwardly on empirical studies is they can be just as reflective of the status quo without interpretation as you know, this abstract theorizing. So it seems to me, and then imagining, you know, how we might teach this in schools, maybe I'd like to hear more about the second level. Okay, so here, very quickly, are my worries. So one is, again, I'm going to put them in related to three, I don't know, categories, just to try to control the mess of thoughts here. One is about your liberalism, one is about your ideal theory, and one is about your normative theory. Commitment to those three things. So liberalism, ideal theory, and normative theory. With respect to liberal theory, does the liberal individual, even yours, depend on what you might call, what a Marxist might call the ruse? That is to say, can the individual agent at the heart of liberal theory, hypothetical and real, exist without hiding or obscuring the costs of care? For example, in the neoliberal context, the family does this, and I think also that private property does this. And as I said, I'm very skeptical of the idea that you can think about these questions in any useful way by bracketing our historical context and specifically the market. It seems that's a worry that I have, at least. And if the answer is that that individual cannot, let's see, I guess I want to say something like, maybe the flip side is, or related to this is, are you a reluctant socialist? Or put another way, is comprehensive or perfectionist, are you a comprehensive or perfectionist liberal? And is that really just a kind of, isn't that really just a kind of socialism, for lack of a better term? And why not embrace it? Okay, so that's my first set of worries. The second one is the area of ideal theory. And on the one hand, I'm super sympathetic that, and this is a worry that has been articulated by people you draw on. So Charles Mills is maybe the most forceful voice of this worry, but it's of course that it obscures and is therefore complicit in an unjust status quo, precisely because it uses, ideal theory relies on language and conceptual frames of the status quo. So, and your argument is, but it pulls us out of, it pulls us out of kind of our deep embeddedness so we can see it critically. But you admit that LDC excludes, for instance, non-human animals, and I would add vibrant matter in thinking about relations of care. or that LDC is only concerned with dependency care. And I think in both cases, you could make the argument that it reifies, doesn't it reify, or here's my question, doesn't that reify, that even that ideal theory, our fantasy that we are not dependent on vibrant matter, or that even if I'm not receiving dependency care right now, I'm not, that is not nested thoroughly in, that we're all always in some sense engaged in some sort of dependence. Okay, and finally, normative theory. I mean, again, my concern here is that, and there, here, I feel like I should have started this all with a shout out to Joan. I think Joan Tronta's work does kind of, is a great example of an attempt to be really embedded in both the market, but the historical context, and maybe well, period. That note was here down at the bottom of my page. So the normative theory question is, does this kind of theorizing displace politics? Which is to say, give us answers to questions that are only, that must be resolved, at least in a democratic society, by the demos who are not going to be educated. I mean, education is not, as Jenny points out, gonna turn everyone into a feminist. And doesn't that, if that's true, do we face a different problem than the ones that are being highlighted by this theory? Okay, that's it.
All right, thank you, Asha. So you feel free to respond. We should probably get to, there are a couple questions here starting to come in. So, but I definitely want to give you a chance to respond to some of that.
Yeah. Thanks. I'll respond just briefly and selectively, and perhaps I'll start with the sort of question about methodology, which I think is a question raised, or a criticism raised, question or criticism raised by both of you. So, what I do in the book is offer a kind of non-ideological ideal theory, and I try to be explicit about what the presuppositions are. That's the sense in which it's non-ideological, and it's also non-ideological in the sense that it begins with this fact, the fact of care and its omission. So I'm identifying, that I'm starting with the claim that was there was a kind of ideology that obscured it from liberalism, and this is a kind of liberalism that is a kind of ideal theory. It's largely focused on ideal theory. That's really the core focus of the book, is this abstract module, and it's non-ideological in that it articulates things in a different way. It articulates the questions of care in a way that's not shaped by a number of dominant ideologies. So, I mean, I think this kind of cross-disciplinary conversation is incredibly important and incredibly fruitful. And I guess I'm kind of in a position of defending the methodology of philosophers of sort of focusing on concepts and the articulation of ways of understanding things. So, I mean, I guess I think there is a valid role for that task. And we might say something about the value of, a division of labor among different theorists. So when I articulate the era of care math, I invite, scholars in empirically grounded fields to employ it. And so it's a way of, it's a new concept that we can use to understand the world. I do think that the labor of articulating new concepts is often quite significant. So when there's a concept that is not the way people already understand it, it can take 3 years to, to convince people to accept the claims as a way of potentially understanding the world. So so I do see some value in that division of labor, although of course, I think philosophy does need to always, as I do with the proposal for strong proceduralism, I make a recommendation. It's one that I think is justified by the spare liberal premises, but I don't think it's necessarily the whole picture about how we could achieve just care. But it's the proposal that I think is firmly grounded in the premises that I've articulated. And I think as Jenny valuably identifies, what will be effective is another question. I think, many of the people here in fields outside of philosophy have better grounding in those questions. I was a consultant for a couple of years, a nonprofit consultant, and, the methodology of identifying actual proposals that will work is a different kind of methodology, and it's admittedly, and deliberately and explicitly not the primary focus of the book. So let's see, I have a lot more to say about these really interesting questions and comments raised by both of you, but I think I might end it there so that we can start the discussion. So thank you so much for these really thoughtful comments.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you for your great presentation, and then thank you, Jenny and Tamara, for those great comments as well. So go ahead and, if you have a question, go ahead. You just type it into the chat. I have a question, and I'll come to you. The first question goes to Eva Kate.
Thank you, Asha. I really enjoyed reading. I'm afraid I couldn't get through to the whole book, but I very much enjoyed reading what I did read. And I want to really thank you for giving such a good account of what I was saying, an unskewed account of what I was saying, even though you would disagree with it. One of the things that I found most interesting in an ethics of care and in much feminist theorizing is the question of relationality. It's a question that you want to bring in. You don't want to bring it in at the start. And I am not sure I can understand why. You say you don't want to put the other directedness, much less any kind of a conception that care work, that we are not mutually disinterested into the original position. And you say because you're afraid that there's so much smuggled into that has been oppressive to women and to people of color, to marginalized groups. The same amount of stuff is smuggled into the idea of the mutually disinterested people, parties. I think Jennifer made a very good point about that when she talked about the Amish. I guess perhaps it's my own upbringing that makes it so difficult for me to see how that notion of the party in the original position is not deeply ideological. And it seems to me that what we want to get at is not a purely relational, it's not a purely relational conception of the person, because we don't want to collapse those individuals who are part of that relationship. We want a dialectical relationship. between individuality and a person, and each of us being an end in ourselves, which is a very liberal conception, and the idea that we are not only that. I think I just don't understand why you think that the mutual disinterested, self-authenticating individual is the purer notion to work from, if that's the right word to use, or the least ideological notion to work from, rather than the person who comes in understanding that they are a product of care and that they need to engage in care in some way. So if you could try to explain that beyond all the explanation you do in your book, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks, Eva, for that question. Yeah, so I think there are two different ways to explain it. One has to do with the distinction between the characterization of real persons and the characterization of people in the original position, contrasted with people in an ideally just world. And that's, in the book, that's in that table 4.1. It's on pages 86 and 87. So that's where I'll show it in a non-high-tech way. Yeah. And it has to do with the function that I see the Rawlsian original position playing as a kind of modeling endeavor. So, so I think the way we model people there allows us to do a kind of tracking of later. It allows us to do a kind of tracking of different interests. And let me actually back up to sort of, well, kind of dialectically to sort of enter into the other part of the explanation, and then I'll go back to that one. So I think in a more sort of experiential context, we might think of cases where people are trying to decide to do something fairly. One person is already considering the interests of others when they articulate what they want to do. So let's say, I'll just come up with an example. Let's say people are deciding what to do for some leisure activity, right? Go to the movies or get ice cream, and it's for a group. So it's a kind of, deliberative exercise of practical reason. The person who's already considering the interests of others will sort of cast their vote in a way that accommodates the interests of everyone else. And thus, their vote will count. Their own interests won't be represented directly in that context. And I think that's a problem when we're thinking about caregiving and relations of deference and consideration, and the way these different, there are a number of different dispositions and capacities that kind of get clustered together and sometimes align with caregiving, sometimes they come apart. But, as Sandra Bartke pointed out, deference has to do with epistemic leaning. There's that in terms of, the hierarchy. Of course, you have that, excellent concept of the transparent self, which I employ in a slightly different way. Then we have, attentiveness and responsiveness from, Toronto. And there are these different skills, but when they're not distributed equally in the population, some people will take into account the needs and interests of others while others are not. And so if they're making a decision together, the outcome is not going to be fair. And so I like the Rawlsian original position. I like the modeling of individuals as, not taking into account the interests of others in the context of a world in which these attributes are distributed in ways that really have to do with social inequality, and perhaps, are really our complete inability to enact a kind of egalitarian ethos or instantiate it in our society. So that's kind of a partial answer, but maybe I'll leave it there.
Just one comeback, and you don't have to answer it, but I just not make the assumption that everyone has to take that other directed stance as well as any kind of self-interested stance. Why? Because then it seems to me you're not winding up with the freeloading, the freeloading, is it freeloading?
The free rider.
Free rider. Then you're not going to wind up with the free rider problem. It seems to me that when you do the individual, that's where the free rider problem starts to come in. So I don't know. We don't have to figure this all out now. But that is my. Maybe we could spend some.
I will just respond very briefly, which is that I think that when I think in the real world, people should be caring and should be caring toward others, but we lose something if we strip our theory. If we strip these individuals from the theory, we lose the ability to sort of have a kind of accounting of needs and interests and well-being by individual. And so that's why I retain that within the Rawlsian original position. It's not at all, the way I think we should interact with one another in a just society, but retaining that conceptual device is, I think, essential, and we can build in interests, we can build in people's concern for others at that second stage.
Okay, I'll pause here, see if any, invite others in if you have questions. I have a question, but I'm willing to hold my question out for a little bit if someone else wants to jump in there. Well, I'm going to ask my question then. So it seems like I was really we've talked about your book, you and I, a fair amount, but in reading it this time. I was really struck by something that it seems like a lot of people are talking about, and I actually think it's a tension in your book between the kind of abstract Rawlsianism and then the very grounded what you're trying to do with the arrow of care, and putting those together. And maybe you have to jump out of one or the other, right? The Rawlsianism, is kind of this abstracted individual, and then the arrow of care, you get right down into the nitty-gritty of society, and you trace out these kind of particular chains of care and who's caring for who and how much care they're doing, and try to pay attention to the way that power is working and all these kinds of things. But I've also been reading or rereading Joan Tronto's Caring Democracy alongside of this. So I was also struck by some similarities, and I don't know, Joan can jump into the conversation or not, here, but I was just wondering, so Joan talks about some of these things, right? Because she wants, she wants democracies to focus on caring, but she doesn't want to abstract. So what she does is she kind of stays within context and points out the passes that people use to get out of caring, and tries to kind of get people, aware of that, or, I don't know how to describe it exactly, offers this critical perspective on that so that people can't use those passes. And then people have to, as I understand it, democratically decide how caring should be distributed. So hers is a caring democracy. Yours is kind of a liberal caring democracy or something. So I don't know. I just wanted to throw that thought out there and maybe think about a little bit how your approach is different from Jones and what that means. What's gained maybe by that slightly more abstract, or some people think, much more abstract perspective, and maybe what's lost.
Thanks. Yeah. So I mean, in terms of Rawlsian liberalism, I have more recently really been emphasizing Rawls's conceptualization of fairness as the fairness of the system of practices, which in some ways is a more flexible articulation of the basic structure. I think it's consistent with the basic structure, but that's how I talk about it in my chapter in Caring for Liberalism. So, that liberal sort of approach to contract theory is one that I think has enduring value. And I'll actually make a comment that I wanted to make in response to Tamara and Jenny earlier as well here on the system of practices. So the liberalism that I'm developing is one that I think, it stays true to foundational elements in Rawls's thinking, which I do value, and also in John Stuart Mill's thinking. And he was actually really contextual, with his thinking about individuality, for example. But what I like about the abstraction is that it allows us to say, okay, what are the caregiving, what's the caregiving arrangement? What are the different practices in this society? Where the practices are not necessarily maybe what we kind of assume serves as an exhaustive list of the practices, the market, the private, family. So, I mean, and there's other interesting, work articulating how to understand these practices. So Metz's, intimate caregiving unions is a way of thinking about these practices in a way that separates them from like the heterosexual, middle class family and those questions about gender. So that abstraction just, I would say, has enduring value. I think I do think the role of the philosopher is one of trying to articulate sort of ways of understanding the world that can be useful, and then that can be contested as well. That can be shown to be inadequate, or that can be shown to be exclusionary of other ways of understanding. So, I mean, so that kind of abstraction really is something that I'm committed to in the theory, and I think it's one of the ways, that that liberal dependency care differs from caring democracy in terms of what they look like on the ground. They might not differ that much, perhaps, and even I've talked about this too, that, some of our proposals might not differ in practicality, but the justification differs. So, yeah, I guess that's how I would answer that question.
Good, thank you.
Yep.
Jenny, you're up.
Okay, thank you. I hate to take up more time and already haven't gotten a chance to speak, but this last exchange has, I think, sharpened something for me, because I thought that Asha's answer to Eva was, the Rawlsian framework will help real people who live in a real unjust world reflect objectively about justice. So there, right? Does that sound right? That I'm recapturing that? The point of this philosophical technique is to help people who live in an unjust world distance themselves from their presuppositions so that they can reflect better about justice.
Well, not exactly, but I'm curious about where you're going.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I doubt that. and that was the point of my story about what it would be like to talk to people, to indigenous people, to people from different diverse, is this, oh, let me tell you about, the Rawlsian original position. This is how we can really do this well. I think for the vast majority of people outside the subculture of liberal philosophers, it would be somewhere between unintelligible and offensive. And I think this connects to Tamara's question about what is the relationship between this particular form of ideal theory and political engagement, right? Knowing that ultimately these questions of care have got to be politically determined, democratically, we hope. And what will facilitate that? What will help us do this? And so I have to say that, I did puzzle for myself, well, why does this stuff, this Rawlsian liberalism, drive me so crazy? And, as I say, there's some autobiographical component to this, but one of the pieces, sometimes it's tacit and sometimes it's explicit, as it was in your answer, is that this is non-ideological. To me, it screams ideology. I hear it as not only alien, but alienating and intended to alienate. But this is not a conversation I feel that I can be part of. Because it starts with a presumption to say that we are all just self-interested and that analytic intelligence is the way to gather together to think about, or separately, to think about justice. Nothing more deeply captures the ideological frame of the particular kind of liberal tradition that we're embedded in. So it's really disturbing to me to hear it characterized as non-ideological. And I think even though you don't always use that word in the book, I heard it. I heard this tacit claim, and that's part of what kept setting me off, such that had I not been committed to finishing the book, I wouldn't have been able to read it. I really wouldn't have been able to read it.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things there. So one, and I'll be sure not to use the term non-ideological in the answer.
My hearing, I think there are other people out there like me.
Yeah, no, but so first, let me just respond about the role of the original position and the role of autonomy skills. So autonomy skills are what I think are needed in the real world. And this is because I think, we don't know what people truly value. I don't know until someone tells me what they truly value. So I'm often, I'm sometimes surprised by what people close to me care about and what they value. It's not what I would assume they would value. It's not, among feminists, we don't all care about the same thing, although we might have some similar doctrinal commitments. And so autonomy skills are a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the legitimacy of the deliberations of the theorists. Autonomy skills in the real world, just among everyone. And of course, we're never going to perfectly achieve them, but they're important to find out, so that people for themselves can learn what they care about. I think, that's an open question. And this is another way in which, I am a liberal, and that I think there's a lot of variation, and some people people live in with a lot of different styles of life. They are committed to different things. And I don't know already, sitting here right now, what everyone values. So autonomy skills are conditioned in the real world. Then the original position is, it is this device, this kind of abstract device. It's not one that I expect real people to engage with. Of course, some of us teach, I teach it and I use it in my bioethics class. We engage in an exercise of original position. When I teach Rawls, we use it, but I don't I don't prescribe employing it kind of in the real world in educational curricula. So then the theorist is like a mediating figure who is the theorist and the community of theorists they're engaging with, right? Who apply pressure to ideas through discourse. That's the person who says, well, I think when we model people this way, this is what we're gonna end up with. And those inputs and those outputs are going to be, they have to be kind of articulated, and then they might need to be modified. So the way in which I try to be non-ideological is by articulating as explicitly as I can what those presuppositions are. And I think, also what presuppositions are always depends on the sort of what the relief, what are they in contrast to? So, some of liberal feminism's presuppositions are some other forms of liberal feminism's presuppositions are those that I do not agree with. And so, articulating the ways in which my view differs from other forms of liberal feminism requires a kind of, right, there is a relationality there in terms of which theory are you, which way of understanding things are you deriving from. So those are those two different, they play two very different roles. And I do, and I said this actually in the session last week with Tamara at the APA, I do think there's something, there's a point to these discursive engagements, like what we're engaged in right now in our activity of writing and thinking and, devoting our lives to doing this. I think I guess that's a defense of normative theory too, that there's some kind of sort of expertise that results from doing it. And that makes me think about Tamara's question about, whether I'm a comprehensive liberal or a perfectionist liberal. I mean, I tend to not define my work as a form of political liberalism, because I think political liberalism often obscures the real normative value claims that are present in it. But I'm not convinced that the distinction between comprehensive and political liberalism really is all that useful when we're kind of not taking the division between public and private spheres for granted, and I don't assume it in the way that some of the liberal tradition does. So yes, there are some normative, there are some value judgments in the theory, which I seek to make explicit. And in that sense, perhaps you might call it a kind of comprehensive liberalism. And it does really endorse autonomy, and this kind of set of autonomy skills that I derived from Diana Myers's work and John Stuart Mill's work. So their account of the sort of real skills people need to be autonomous is something that I assert a positive value for.
Tamara.
Sorry, let's see. I had a very clear question or comment, and your last one just kind of got me thinking on another track. You know what? I saw another hand up. I'll just jump in when it comes back to me, because now I'm sorry.
And I think I saw Virginia Hell's hand. I don't know if you, yeah. I think you're still muted.
Yeah, still muted. Oh, no. I think, so bottom left.
Oh, maybe she was leaving. I don't know.
No, I think she had her hand up.
Okay.
Yeah, so bottom left corner, the mute button.
Sometimes you need to press a button on your computer or no, actually that wouldn't work.
Oh, okay. Oh, let's see.
You can also use the space bar, I think.
Okay, I think maybe that's worked.
There, you're
Yeah,
on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I first of all wanted to say I found all the talks really interesting and the comments and discussion so far. And I didn't think I had a question or a comment, but I do want to ask Jennifer, even if this liberal way of thinking is foreign, I don't know, not something that one likes to engage in all that much, if one thinks of it as a very limited way of thinking for the exercise of political power, then doesn't it become a lot more acceptable within a much larger framework of caring relations and that kind of thing? So it's a question for Jennifer.
So I want to make sure I am understanding you. That is the question, do I think that, you know, in a country like the United States that thinks of itself as a liberal democracy, the liberal framework of debating is useful for people in political power? A useful constraint, say. Is that the question?
And since everybody has some political power as voters or something, I mean, for the political, for the limited domain of exercising political power, including voting, then the thinking in terms of equality and self-interest and how could we forge some kind of actual policy out of all these disparate views and interests, isn't it more acceptable then if you think of it that way?
No. and let me start with a point that both Tamara and I made very briefly, but it's actually foundational, which is care for the earth. It's not care for the earth.
Oh, right.
Right? Our relationship to the earth.
Good point. Very good point.
Right? We now know that the failure to take that seriously as a bedrock of any political and any philosophical understanding of a good life, of a fair life, of a just life, of an equal life, whatever your, of an autonomous life, you know, has to be embedded in our understanding of ourselves as part of an earth community in which we cannot escape and which we are damaging, perhaps irrevocably. So that
could be part of the wider society, not part of just the very limited political exercise of political power.
But it has to be part of the limited exercise of political power. If it's not, which it hasn't been, we see the consequences.
Right.
Can I, so here, I was actually, this was where my thought was going. Virginia, you, in a way, you articulated what I was thinking about. So Jenny, your portrayal is that this is only useful for a kind of amongst the rarefied context of Rawlsian philosophers, or maybe their students. And my instinct, maybe this is, Virginia, your question, this is what your question is pointing at, is that, well, it's actually really, like, I think about it, why do I teach my liberalism course? Why is Rawls the center of my liberalism course? And the answer is Rawls articulates the presupposition, the assumptions of my students. I mean, it's kind of remarkable how, you know, after the first couple of weeks of working through Rawls, it's like they have heard someone speak their, you know, their insides. Now that's a limited, you know, it's a limited set of citizens of a limited space on the planet. So I think of myself as, well, when I'm teaching Rawls and then teaching a critique of Rawls or a criticism of Rawls, I am contributing to political life, to a kind of education of citizens in this, in a way that's valuable for, I think, exactly the reasons that Asha is pointing out, that it sort of this abstraction helps my students see what they believe and then maybe assess it. Okay, but your point articulates the concern, which is that just to reiterate, I guess, that that it is also, it runs into the problem of being ideological if it is presented as just if it isn't deeply embedded in the historic, like an analysis of those abstract terms aren't immediately embedded in a critical analysis of the language, the concepts, the history, whatever from which they're emerging. And so what I see in Asha's book is an attempt to do these two things at the same time. I think something, maybe I'm, but you know, the abstract, and then a kind of this, in a much more serious way than any Rawlsian I've ever seen, kind of gesture to the historical context. And I wonder if there's enough of the latter to keep the former non-ideological. I don't know if that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think all theorists are, we're here now, all of us here are here wherever we are, right, in the Zoom meeting, but also in some actual location and in time. And that's part of the view for me, that, theorists who are engaging with this exercise to decide, what range of arrangements, and for me, it really comes down to constraints that we specify, what constraints on arrangements are acceptable to everyone, irrespective of our social position. The person engaging in that exercise will probably be, a theorist, but they are also, they have a particular history and a particular context. Now, I don't think the history and the context exactly prescribe what the person will conclude, because of we might think of it in terms of Jose Medina's concept of metalucidity, because of the ways in which we can gain sort of the understanding of different perspectives and have, you might think of it as a kind of cross-cultural understanding of different ways of being. So I don't think we're fully limited by what we have experienced, but we are, in the book I talk about, who we're accountable to as well. I think that creates a constraining pressure on the theorist. So the communities you're accountable to, with your writing, with your theorizing, are going to influence the validity of they're going to influence what you decide on. So, the theorist's endeavor is embedded, but it's not a direct outcome of, I don't think you just put the inputs in to, you kind of list, okay, Asha Bandari, Finnish mother, Indian father, grew up in, whatever, I'm not going to give my full biography, but, okay, then, put in those inputs and you get this book. That's, there was no kind of creative or critical sort of effort. So, again, I guess I'm insisting on there being some kind of contribution that comes about from the exercise of doing philosophy, of being a philosopher, being a political theorist. It contributes something that would not be there had you not undergone that training and that experience. I don't know if that answers your worry.
I think maybe another way to put it is, for me, and I'm so sympathetic to to me, this has been I think it's, I'm very sympathetic to this problem. And I think that the question is, how far away can we get from a kind of critical analysis of the context in which we find ourselves before what we are, describing it in these kind of abstract terms becomes ideological. Maybe that would be, it's a question that I don't know if it's to me a question as a political philosopher that seems urgent to me.
Yeah. And I guess I would say, we're all employing concepts and theoretical frameworks and ways of understanding, the world. Our social form is informing that. So there's no view from nowhere. I'm not trying to defend that. So then it kind of comes down to how we're defining ideology. I think of ideology often as the articulation of a view as neutral when it's in fact serving the interests of people with power. And so I think the theory of liberal dependency care is non-ideological in the sense that it is very clear about the expectations. The view, the understanding from liberal dependency care comes about from the sort of expectations placed on people who are assumed to be those who will tend to others. So, if we think about it as, broadly as thinking, about sort of the social positions that women of color occupy, making that the orienting lens shifts the view. And I think insofar as, in the global, our sort of global order, people who are expected to care for others are not usually the people who have the most power. It's not ideological in that way because it's not serving power. Now, of course, we could tell a story 100 years into the future where things change and then it's serving an ideology. But I think its relationship to the status quo is what makes it non-ideological.
I want to jump in here. This is for anyone, we're sort of moving into, I think, discussion phase where anyone can jump in. But so it seems like Tamara, what you were just saying, and maybe what Jenny was saying a bit was, it's sort of like abstraction, being abstract is coming to be associated like with ideological or the non-critical, but I see this just the opposite, right? And this is, I think the way Asha is employing, kind of a Rawlsian abstraction, right? Again, reading Jones' Caring Democracy recently, I'm just struck by like, wow, it's so hard to get to caring democracy because people have to put aside such deep, just, deep assumptions about, who does caring, what caring is, just these kind of like, well, you get a bunch of people to talk about, care work and, who should do it. And of course, the first thing, well, my wife loves to care for the kids, right? She'll do it, right? So you have to start, but that's a really, these are really hard assumptions to unearth from people. So, so you need to get away from that, right? You need to get away from the particular. And I guess, when you get too far away from the particular, you run into trouble again. But I think like Asha's sort of trying to bounce between those to I don't know. You guys can say. I think maybe I'm misunderstanding some of what you're saying.
No, I agree with you that Asha is trying to balance between those two things, and I think actually any of us who are doing good political theory are going to have to balance between those two things. There are two ways in which I think increased. I would have, let's see, in the particular case, like to see more attention paid to capitalism as a part of the context, and also our relationship to the vibrant matter. To me, those get bracketed, and they seem actually the bracketing. That's an example of where I might worry about it becoming ideological.
Just, in terms of the market, and in markets and capitalism, which are two separate but intertwined topics. I don't address them because I think care, if we look at any human society, every society has some kind of solution to its caregiving arrangement. So it's legitimately more fundamental than the role of markets and then our specific kind of capitalism. So I've never been very attracted to thinking about questions about how we should engage in, paying for care or whether we shouldn't. And that's, I think, because the focus for me in this project has been at a pretty abstract level in terms of thinking about different social forms. And I think there are a wide range of practices that could work. We probably are seeing a lot of the practices that don't work in the real world, but the number of practices that could be part of a just society, the number of care practices that could be part of a just society are open-ended to me. And so I don't really want to weigh in on them.
Okay, so there are a couple of people who want to get in who haven't had a chance to speak. So Suraj, and then Lena.
Thank you. So I'm sorry I joined the discussion a little late. I had some teaching commitments, but so the discussion on ideology was something that really got my attention, and I was trying to explore whether Professor Nedelsky and Professor Bhandari were actually talking past one another. And so what would be a little helpful would be exactly what is the specific sense in which we are saying that Rawls is ideological, right? So it seems to me that for Professor Bhandari, when she's talking about ideology, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the purpose of ideology for Professor Bhandari seems to be more political as opposed to epistemic. And her concern is that, look, there is no position which is a view from nowhere, right? And when there are positions which are trying to masquerade around as being purely objective and being a view from nowhere, that's where ideology seeps in. So there seems to be something political and over there with regard to articulations of views as supposedly neutral. And this is where ideology comes into the picture. And the Rawlsian ideology, I'm not too sure, but it seemed to me that the Rawlsian theory is not really ideological. And Professor Bhandari's project is to sort of unearth the underlying assumptions and show that, look, there are certain liberal assumptions over there at play. It's not a view from nowhere, but now that the picture, the underlying assumptions are clear enough for all of us, it's no longer ideological in the political sense. Like, it's not masquerading as a view from nowhere. And I think Professor Nedelsky was sort of going further in her articulation of ideology, and she seemed to be having more of a Marxist understanding, and suggests that, the problem with Rawls is that it seems to be alienating because the Rawlsian philosophy seems to be epistemically unreliable when we are trying to ascertain certain issues of injustice or justice. And so, I was just kind of hoping if we could have a little more discussion, both from Professor Nedelsky and Professor Bhandari, about the specific sense in which they understand the word ideology, because there's a huge debate regarding that, and then sort of assess Rawls from that perspective. So very shortly, that's the concern.
Yeah. I'll just respond briefly to say, I identify a flaw in Rawls's thinking, and it's a flaw that requires the work of Eva Katay and Virginia Held and Joan Toronto, and others to articulate. So the flaw that Rawls did not address care, at least not in the sort of foundations of his work, is a flaw. And my project is not to really save Rawls or save liberalism. I'm advancing a new constructive form of liberalism and asserting that I think the Rawlsian idea of the original position has value. I don't really think his difference principle and the two principles necessarily follow, but it's this core idea of hypothetical acceptability and the way of this way of understanding justice as fairness that has value. So I'm building on liberal foundations for the theory of liberal dependency care. And so I think, Rawls, and so that's all I have to say about Rawls. He plays an important role in my theory in terms of the idea of hypothetical acceptability, but I also am not really concerned with the extent to which he in particular, his work in particular, is ideological or not. So yeah, and then I mean, I wonder, Jenny, if you want to respond. I think it's an interesting question, Suraj, that you've raised. Oh, I think you're
muted. Yeah.
You're muted, Jenny.
Thanks. So I'm not going to try to actually define ideology. I think what captures better what my concern was a claim of neutrality. But I just want to step back for a moment and respond a bit also to what Tamara said about why does she teach liberalism, and to connect it to Asha's project here, which is I think it is extremely important to help students understand what the frame they're using is, and then to bring a critical perspective to it. And so I think what my concern about Asha's project is that it does and it does not bring a critical perspective. So she chooses not to bring a critical perspective to the basic, to the original position. On the other hand, the thing that troubles me most about the original position is its individualism. And its refusal to see interdependence as a fundamental dimension of human nature. However, everything else Asha is doing in the book is drawing our attention to our human dependency. Although I will say that that's part of why I didn't spend much time on this. Why, and the definition of dependency care, I think, is actually way too limited for helping people to understand how all of us are dependent on one another and on the earth and on the earth community all of the time. It's not just when we're sick or disabled or infants, it's always and everywhere. And that's the fundamental critique, that why the whole idea of the original position as a helpful way to think about the basic structure seems mistaken to me. But I think the actual effect of Asha's book is to get the people who do think in those terms to recognize this really huge failure of not taking care seriously. And to the extent that it accomplishes that for that non-trivial subset of people in the world, that's really important. I don't feel part of that tribe, but I recognize it's out there and it wields a lot of power, and it would be really great if it understood why it has to take care seriously. And I think there's a good chance that if they read Asha's book, they'll see that. And so that's tremendously important. But I guess I just wanted Asha to reflect on the ways in which the form of engagement with the original position can be seriously off-putting to a whole group of people who basically share her concerns around care, though not necessarily her preferences about how to think through puzzles.
Just on the dependency care versus a broader understanding of care point, that I mean, I focus on dependency care because it requires this kind of hands-on activity, you know, and I'm employing Eva's work here, this hands-on activity by a caregiver, and that creates a different kind of constraint on the body of the caregiver, one that's more immediate and more proximate than other kinds of care. So I think that's the way to understand to best understand questions of distributive justice and distributive arrangements. We need to sort of focus in on that. But it's true that there are many other questions of care.
But they're specifically on that. There's so many hands-on forms of care that, you know, all the women who make dinner for their husbands and do their laundry and wash their dishes. This is hands-on care that is not dependency care.
And that's personal, right? I talk about that as personal service.
I know, but I just think, and I will just on a word about paid care, you know, some of the worst abuses around unjust distributions of care happen for domestic workers all over the world. Really, really serious. I mean, slavery-like conditions. So that our worldwide, our system of managing care relies on an incredible layer of abuse that can only be fully captured when we look at paid care as well as unpaid care.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question. So Lena, you've been waiting, thank you.
I don't know that I want to be the last one to go. So thank you so much for this incredible conversation. It's been really enlightening. And so I'm a historian, and I'm actually currently engaging Asha's work for my own understandings of reproductive health and reproductive care. And so I guess, and I'm specifically looking at the lives of women of color, of Latinas, of people who were domestic care workers. And I guess for me, as somebody who does not deal in the abstract, who is very much wedded to material sources and to sort of actual historical things that have occurred and sort of making sense of them, there is something liberating for me to be able to engage in these kinds of conversations that I hope will provide spaces to think about the women I'm writing about in different, more humane and more human ways. Oftentimes, and again, I'm not a philosopher, and although I am, working alongside Asha's work with other Chicana feminist theorists, but there is something I guess I just wanted to say, there's something important and liberating about being able to engage ideas in a way that does abstract the thing. That allows you in some ways to use your imagination for the ways things might be. And so I guess I don't, while yes, sometimes it is frustrating because you ask yourself, well, how will this work in the real world? But if we don't have these moments, I think intellectually to pause and be able to imagine other worlds beyond our own, then we can't make those worlds exist. And oftentimes we make assumptions about communities on the front lines, historically marginalized communities, that they don't do this work, that they don't engage in sort of philosophical thinking or in imaginative thinking. And so for me, reading Asha's book has been in some ways kind of a rest from the sort of material space. Right, and I think that as a scholar of color who's looking at the history of women of color, that is a space that I'm not often afforded. And so I just want to say thank you to Asha for, in many ways, sort of producing a space for scholars of color, and particularly women of color, to think outside, right, of what is prescribed or what is allowed. And to push outside the limits of what is possible. And so I just, I'm sitting with all of your comments and taking vociferous notes. I have quite a reading list assembled after this conversation. But as far as just the especially in the pandemic, where I feel like our imagination has just been so brutally stunted, it really was a pleasure to be able to spend time in these abstract spaces just for a moment. So thank you, Asha, for your work. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Lena.
Yeah, thank you. What a beautiful and inspiring way to end. Thank you for those comments. I felt that today. I mean, I thought this conversation was great. I really enjoyed it. It's not often I'm fully engaged, even when I host for 2 hours, even when I'm teaching, you drift off sometimes, but I was fully engaged today. So thanks to everyone for this. Thank you especially to Asha. We have Sarah, I think. Oh, there you are. You're still here. Good. It must be what? It's 10 o'clock there or something. It's past 10 o'clock.
It's only 8. It's only 8.
Oh, it's only 8. Okay, so it's not too late. Well, anyway, so Sarah will be presenting in 2 weeks. I'll send out an email again about that and a link for her paper. But anyway, thank you all for being here. I have to step away, but I can just, if any of you want to just stay on to chat with each other for a moment before you leave, I'm happy to let the Zoom call ride on.